The 80-20 rule of security, Pareto principle. Opening the illusion of thoroughness. There is a particular kind of anxiety that lives inside security teams, and it is worth naming before we go any further. It is the anxiety of incompleteness. The feeling that you have not done enough, that there is always another tool to deploy, another alert to investigate, another framework to implement, another vendor promising that their product is the one that will finally close the gap. Security culture is saturated with this anxiety. And in small doses, that anxiety is useful. It keeps professionals from becoming complacent. But in larger doses, it becomes one of the most dangerous failure modes in the field. Here is what that anxiety produces in practice. Organizations that spend their budget on threat intelligence platforms before they have deployed multi-factor authentication. Law firms that purchase dark web monitoring subscriptions before they have enabled automated patching on their laptops. Enterprise SOCs that tune machine learning anomaly detection models before they have suppressed the noisy scanner alerts that bury every queue. In each case, something sophisticated was prioritized over something foundational, and the foundational gap is precisely what the attacker will use. The 80-20 rule of security asks you to sit with a deeply uncomfortable question. If 20% of your security controls are responsible for 80% of your actual protection, do you know which 20% that is? Most professionals, if they are honest, cannot answer that question with confidence. They can name the tools they have. They can describe the frameworks they follow. But the specific, prioritized identification of the highest leverage controls, the ones that do the most work, that prevent the most common attacks, that close the most frequently exploited gaps, that articulation is rare. This session is about developing that articulation and understanding exactly why it matters, how it shapes every implementation decision, how its absence creates specific and diagnosable failures, and what it looks like when it is applied with discipline under the constraints of the real world. The foundation, what the principle actually claims. Vilfredo Pareto was an Italian economist who noticed in 1896 that approximately 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. He then noticed the same pattern in his garden. 80% of his peas came from 20% of his pea pods. The observation generalized. In many systems, a small proportion of causes is responsible for a large proportion of effects. The ratio is not always exactly 80-20. Sometimes it is 90-10. Sometimes 70-30. The insight is not about the specific numbers. It is about the disproportionate distribution of impact. Applied to security, the principle makes a specific and falsifiable claim. It claims that the vast majority of successful attacks exploit a relatively small set of well-known weaknesses. Not zero days, not nation-state tooling, not cryptographic vulnerabilities. The ordinary, documented, embarrassingly predictable weaknesses that have appeared in breach reports for 15 years. Default credentials, unpatched systems, no multi-factor authentication, excessive permissions, missing endpoint visibility. Phishing that bypasses a distracted user. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, one of the most comprehensive longitudinal datasets in the industry, has found this pattern reliably across its annual publications. The majority of breaches involve credential theft, phishing, and exploitation of known unpatched vulnerabilities, not hypothetical attack vectors, not theoretical weaknesses requiring sophisticated tradecraft. The same categories year after year against organizations of every size and sector. This means that a security program designed primarily to address these categories, not exclusively, but primarily, will prevent a disproportionate share of real attacks. It means that a security program built around exotic capabilities before these fundamentals are addressed is poorly prioritized. And it means that the measure of a security program's maturity is not the sophistication of its most advanced tool. It is the completeness of its most foundational controls. Understanding this at a theoretical level is the first step. The harder step is understanding what it means to operationalize it, because the principle does not tell you what the 20% is in your specific environment. It tells you that a 20% exists, and that your job is to find it, protect it, and not confuse complexity with coverage. Risk management, properly understood, is the discipline that lets you find that 20%. When you perform a risk assessment, you are not cataloging every possible bad thing that could happen to your organization. You are building a ranked list. Likelihood multiplied by impact, applied to the specific assets and threat actors relevant to your context. The risks that cluster at the top of that list, the ones with high likelihood and high impact, are where the Pareto principle points you. They are not always the most technically interesting problems. They are the most important ones. The 4 risk treatment options, avoidance, mitigation, transfer, and acceptance, each play a role in a Pareto-focused program. Avoidance removes the risk entirely by eliminating the activity or asset. Mitigation reduces the likelihood or impact through a control. Transfer shifts the financial consequence, typically through insurance. Acceptance acknowledges the risk and decides it is not worth the cost of treatment. In a Pareto-focused program, the question you ask before each treatment decision is, how much of the overall risk picture does addressing this particular item actually change? A sophisticated control that addresses a low probability, low-impact risk may be technically elegant and operationally irrelevant. A blunt, inelegant control that addresses a high probability, high-impact risk delivers genuine protection. The CVSS scoring system is one of the tools that operationalizes this kind of prioritization in vulnerability management. A CVSS base score reflects the characteristics of the vulnerability itself, how exploitable it is, what the impact of exploitation would be, whether it crosses a privilege or scope boundary. A score of 9 or above represents a critical vulnerability. A score below 4 represents a low-severity issue. In a Pareto-focused vulnerability program, the critical and high scores are the 20%. They are not the only vulnerabilities you address, but they are the first. And within the critical category, the vulnerabilities listed in CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog deserve even higher priority, because they represent vulnerabilities that have already been used in real attacks. The 20% within the 20%. The problem with CVSS alone, and this is important, is that it scores the vulnerability in isolation. A critical CVSS score on a system that processes no sensitive data, has no connectivity to the rest of the network, and is managed by a team with no privileged access is a very different risk than the same score on a domain controller in a financial services firm. Context transforms the score into a risk. This is why asset inventory is itself a foundational control. Without knowing what you have, where it sits in your architecture, and what it connects to, you cannot calculate context. You can only read scores, and reading scores without context is not risk management. It is risk theater. The structural tension, completeness against focus. Here is where the principle becomes genuinely difficult to apply, because it cuts against 2 things that security professionals are trained to value. The first is completeness. Security frameworks are comprehensive by design. ISO 27001 contains more than 100 controls. The NIST cybersecurity framework covers 5 functions and dozens of subcategories. The CIS controls span 18 control families. These frameworks exist because they were built from the accumulated experience of many organizations facing many different threat environments. No reasonable person argues that a mature organization should ignore the parts of these frameworks that fall outside the 20%. The argument is about sequence, about what you do first with the resources you have now, before you expand coverage toward completeness. The second thing the principle cuts against is the natural gravitational pull of sophisticated problems. Security is a field full of intellectually stimulating challenges. Threat hunting is interesting. Red team operations are interesting. Adversarial machine learning is interesting. Honeypot architectures, deception technology, and custom detection engineering are interesting. Basic patching and MFA rollout are not interesting. They are operational. They are often politically difficult because they create friction. They require sustained organizational will rather than technical cleverness. The Pareto principle is partly a corrective against the field's own tendency to pursue the intellectually engaging problem over the impactful one. The central tension in applying the 80-20 rule to security is the tension between doing the boring foundational work completely and doing the interesting sophisticated work prematurely. Both failures are real. An organization that only ever maintains foundational hygiene and never builds detection depth will eventually be unable to detect a sophisticated attacker who has navigated around those controls. An organization that invests in detection depth before it has reliable asset inventory and patching will be breached through a gap it could have closed for the cost of a configuration change. The resolution is sequencing, not exclusivity. The principle does not say that only the 20% matters. It says the 20% comes first, receives the most consistent investment, and is measured for completeness before the remaining 80% receives focus. This is how a security roadmap is supposed to work. Not as a wish list of capabilities in the order they were pitched by vendors, but as a prioritized sequence grounded in the actual distribution of risk. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework's maturity model supports this structure. Partial maturity, the lowest tier, is characterized by an ad hoc and reactive security posture. Informed maturity introduces risk-aware practices. Repeatable maturity formalizes and consistently applies those practices. Adaptive maturity integrates continuous learning and improvement. Moving through these tiers is not possible if you skip the foundational layer. Adaptive maturity built on an incomplete foundational layer is not advanced security. It is a sophisticated facade over a fundamental gap. The architecture of the brilliant basics. Let us make this concrete. What does the 20% actually contain? Not in the abstract sense of it varies by organization, which is true but unhelpful, but in the sense of what shows up consistently across the research as the highest leverage controls. Asset inventory is the first and arguably the most foundational. You cannot protect what you do not know exists. This sounds obvious, and yet it remains one of the most pervasive failures in enterprise security. Shadow IT, the devices, applications, and services that people use without formal IT approval, creates an attack surface that the security team does not know to monitor, patch, or control. An attacker who finds an unmanaged device connected to your network has found a gap that no amount of sophisticated tooling on the managed fleet will address. A continuous asset discovery capability, one that identifies new devices within hours of connection rather than days, is foundational to everything else. Without it, your vulnerability management program is operating on incomplete data. Your network segmentation may contain unaccounted paths, and your incident response will periodically surface assets you did not know you had. Multi-factor authentication on every privileged access point is the second. The reason credential theft dominates breach statistics is not that attackers are particularly clever. It is that credentials are the key to the kingdom, and a single factor of authentication, a password, is far easier to steal than most organizations acknowledge. Phishing captures passwords, data breaches leak them. Password reuse spreads them across services. Malware harvests them from memory. MFA does not make credential theft impossible, but it raises the cost dramatically. A stolen password combined with a required hardware token or push notification adds an entire attack step that many opportunistic attackers are not equipped to bypass. Phishing-resistant MFA, specifically hardware tokens or passkey-based authentication that binds the credential to a specific device and cannot be intercepted by a proxy, is the highest assurance form. Standard TOTP and push notification MFA are meaningful improvements over no MFA. They are not the final destination, but they are the 20%. Deploying them widely delivers an enormous reduction in credential-based attack success. Patching with particular urgency on known exploited vulnerabilities is the third. The concept of Patch Tuesday, the monthly scheduled release of security patches from major software vendors, reflects an era when the patch cycle was longer than the exploitation window. That era has passed. CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog documents vulnerabilities that threat actors have actively weaponized. The time between public disclosure and active exploitation has compressed to days in many cases. A vulnerability management program that reviews the KEV catalog weekly and treats items on it as emergency patches regardless of their scheduled maintenance window is a program operating in the current threat environment. One that treats all patches with equal urgency regardless of exploitation status is a program optimizing for compliance optics rather than risk reduction. Endpoint visibility and baseline behavioral controls form the fourth pillar. An EDR deployed across the managed fleet with sensible baseline rules, blocking unsigned PowerShell execution, preventing common credential dumping techniques, alerting on suspicious parent-child process relationships, provides a detection and response capability that covers the most common post-compromise attacker behaviors. Not all of them, not the sophisticated custom implants of a nation-state actor, but the commodity tooling that characterizes the vast majority of ransomware and opportunistic intrusions. The key word is baseline. EDR deployed with default settings and no tuning is not the same as EDR deployed thoughtfully. The defaults are a starting point. The security team's knowledge of the specific environment, what is normal, what is unusual, is what converts defaults into coverage. Email filtering with attachment sandboxing and URL rewriting covers the most common initial access vector. Phishing is the entry point in a substantial fraction of breaches. A secure email gateway that filters known malicious senders, rewrites links to pass through a real-time reputation check at click time, and detonates suspicious attachments in an isolated environment before delivery closes the majority of the phishing attack surface. It does not close all of it. Targeted spear phishing from freshly registered domains against specific individuals will sometimes evade signature-based and reputation-based controls. That is the 80% of the problem space, the sophisticated, targeted attack. The 20% of effort, a well-configured secure email gateway, addresses the 80% of attacks that are not sophisticated and not targeted. Network segmentation, even at a basic level, is the fifth pillar. The value of segmentation is not in its complexity. It is in its existence. A flat network where every device can communicate with every other device means that a compromised workstation can reach the domain controller, the backup server, and the financial system database without any lateral movement barrier. Basic segmentation, separating workstations from servers, separating guest and wireless networks from internal systems, isolating OT where it exists, does not require a micro-segmentation platform running zero-trust policy enforcement on every packet. It requires a firewall with sensible rules and a network architecture that was designed with isolation as a principle rather than an afterthought. These five pillars, asset inventory, MFA, patching, endpoint visibility, email security, and network segmentation, are not exotic. They are not new. Every security framework includes them. The reason they bear repetition in the context of the Pareto principle is that they are underinvested in at an extraordinary rate across organizations of every size. Not because organizations are unaware of them, because organizations face the temptation of the sophisticated problem over the foundational one, and because foundational work is politically harder to fund than a product launch. Tools and the leverage they carry. Every tool in the security ecosystem can be evaluated through the Pareto lens. The question is not whether the tool is good. The question is, at what stage of foundational maturity should this tool be introduced, and what is the ratio of the protection it provides to the operational cost it imposes? Consider MFA platforms like those built on FIDO2 or TOTP with a push notification option. The protection they provide against credential-based attacks is among the highest per dollar of any control in the security portfolio. The deployment cost is real user training, help desk call volume during rollout, integration with legacy applications that do not support modern authentication protocols, but it is bounded and finite. Once deployed, MFA requires maintenance rather than continuous investment. The ratio of protection to cost is favorable at almost every stage of organizational maturity, which is why it belongs in the 20%. Now consider a user and entity behavior analytics platform. UEBA applies machine learning to build behavioral baselines for every user and entity in the environment, then flags deviations. When someone's account starts accessing unusual file shares at 3 in the morning, UEBA notices. This is genuinely valuable capability, but UEBA requires good data to work. It requires accurate, comprehensive logging from your identity provider, your file servers, your endpoint fleet, your VPN, and your cloud applications. If those log sources are incomplete or inconsistent, the baseline is inaccurate and the alerts are noisy. UEBA introduced before reliable log coverage exists is not advanced detection capability. It is expensive noise generation. The sequencing matters. UEBA belongs after the foundational logging infrastructure is in place, not before. Consider a vulnerability management platform like Tenable or Qualys. The platform itself is a tool. What it does with that tool is a prioritization problem. A vulnerability management program that scans the environment, generates a list of thousands of findings sorted by CVSS score, and assigns them to remediation queues based on score alone is not applying the Pareto principle. It is performing triage theater. The program that filters findings against the asset context. Is this asset on the network perimeter? Does it hold sensitive data? Is it a domain controller or a development sandbox? And then cross-references against the KEV catalog to identify findings that require emergency treatment regardless of CVSS score is applying the principle. The same tool. Dramatically different outcomes based on whether the prioritization logic is present. An EDR platform deployed with only out-of-box detection rules is a different proposition from one deployed with tuned rules that reflect the specific behavioral norms of the environment. PowerShell execution is normal in a Windows administration environment. It is not normal on a workstation in a law firm. The baseline detection rule that flags unsigned PowerShell execution will generate constant noise in the first environment and meaningful signal in the second, unless the rule is tuned to the context. EDR that generates noise trains analysts to ignore it. EDR that generates signal trains analysts to act. The tool is the same. The operational value is not. A SIEM without alert tuning is worth discussing specifically, because it is perhaps the clearest case of the Pareto principle being violated in practice. A SIEM can ingest logs from hundreds of sources and run thousands of correlation rules. Out of the box, many SIEMs generate enormous alert volumes because the rules were written to catch every possible variant of every known attack technique, without regard for what constitutes normal behavior in a specific environment. The result is an alert queue that no team can process. Analysts triage the top of the queue, run out of time, and restart the next shift at the same point. Critical signals buried in the noise go unactioned for hours or days. The Pareto fix for a SIEM is deliberate reduction, not suppression of every alert that fires frequently. Frequency alone does not mean an alert is unimportant, but systematic measurement of true positive rate per rule, followed by targeted tuning of the rules with high volume and low fidelity. A SOC that has tuned its alert stream to the point where the majority of alerts require and receive meaningful analyst attention is a SOC operating with Pareto discipline. A SOC that is processing thousands of alerts per shift without measuring which ones have ever led to a confirmed incident is not. Implementation, applying the 20% under real conditions. Two implementation scenarios illustrate the principle under different constraints. The first is a vulnerability management program built from scratch in a mid-sized organization with a backlog of unpatched systems spanning years. The initial scan produces a list of 12,000 findings across 400 assets. The organization has 2 engineers on the patching team and a 4-hour weekly maintenance window. If every finding is treated with equal urgency, nothing gets done. The system of prioritization must be built before the remediation begins. The first step is asset classification. Not every asset carries the same risk weight. Domain controllers, internet-facing web servers, VPN concentrators, and systems holding regulated data are Tier 1 assets. Internal development workstations that do not process production data are Tier 3. Vulnerabilities on Tier 1 assets receive immediate attention regardless of CVSS score. Vulnerabilities on Tier 3 assets enter the normal patching cadence. The second step is KEV filtering. Every finding is cross-referenced against CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. Any finding on the KEV list on any asset is treated as an emergency regardless of tier classification. These are the vulnerabilities attackers have already demonstrated willingness and capability to exploit. The 4-hour maintenance window can be interrupted for these. Getting sign-off for an emergency change requires organizational alignment in advance, which means the vulnerability management policy must explicitly define the escalation path and authorization level for emergency patches before the first emergency arises. The third step is establishing a baseline and measuring progress. The 12,000 findings are not the target. Reducing findings on Tier 1 assets below a specific threshold within a defined timeframe is the target. Progress is reported as a percentage of Tier 1 critical findings remediated, not as raw finding count. Raw count rewards finding new vulnerabilities, which is useful but is not the primary objective. Percentage remediation on the most important assets rewards closing the gaps that matter most. The second implementation scenario is an RBAC configuration in Active Directory for a company whose access control model has never been formally designed. Every department has grown its own access patterns organically. Finance users have access to HR folders because someone copied a permissions template from HR 8 years ago and nobody noticed. Developers have domain admin accounts because it was the easiest way to give them what they needed 3 years ago. Applying the Pareto principle here means resisting the temptation to redesign the entire access model simultaneously. A complete rebuild of Active Directory permissions is a multi-quarter project that creates organizational disruption and helpdesk load. The 20% approach identifies the highest-risk configurations first. Domain admins who are not in the IT team, service accounts with interactive login rights, shared credentials used by multiple departments, any account with privileged access that has not been used in the last 60 days. These are the configurations that an attacker will exploit if they get a foothold. They are the configurations that create the most dangerous lateral movement paths. Addressing these first, before touching the permissions of every workgroup folder and printer share, delivers the most risk reduction per hour of effort invested. The adjacent consideration in both scenarios is documentation. Every prioritization decision should be documented as an explicit choice. If you are not patching low-severity findings on Tier 3 assets for 3 months, that is not an oversight. It is a decision, and the documentation of that decision includes the risk rationale, the compensating controls in place, and the review trigger, the condition under which you would revisit the decision. Without documentation, the decision becomes invisible and institutional memory about why it was made evaporates. The next security review will produce a finding about the low-severity gap, and without the documented rationale, the organization will appear negligent rather than strategically prioritized. When the 20% is missing, the troubleshooting lens. 3 failure scenarios show the principle through its absence. The first is the buried critical alert. A SOC analyst is reviewing the morning shift handover. The previous shift processed 4,000 alerts. The handover notes are thin, nothing significant routine activity. Later that day, a threat intelligence feed flags an IP address that appears in the organization's firewall logs from the previous evening. Investigation reveals that the IP was associated with a known ransomware group's initial access infrastructure. The relevant alert fired at 11:30 the previous evening and was never actioned. It was alert number 2312 in the queue. The root cause here is a failure to apply Pareto principles to alert prioritization. Alert number 2312 was visible, but it was not differentiated from the alerts around it by severity, urgency, or source fidelity. The SOC was treating the queue as FIFO, first in, first out, rather than as a prioritized list where certain signal types demand immediate attention regardless of queue position. The fix begins with alert taxonomy. Not all alerts are created equal. Alerts from threat intelligence enrichment that match a known active threat actor infrastructure deserve a fast lane. Alerts from a scheduled scanner scanning its own authorized targets deserve either suppression or a slow lane. Building this taxonomy requires measuring the true positive rate of each alert source over time and using that measurement to establish handling priority. A rule that has never produced a confirmed true positive in 6 months is a rule that should be moved to the slow lane for review. A rule that produces true positives 1 in 3 times it fires deserves analyst attention within the hour, not within the shift. The second failure scenario involves a SOC analyst at an MSSP whose customer is receiving too many low-priority alerts and has escalated the complaint. The analyst pulls the previous 30 days of alert data for the customer. The top 5 alert types by volume account for 67% of all alerts. Of those 5 types, the true positive rate across the entire period is under 3%. 3%. For every 100 alerts the SOC processed from these 5 categories, 3 led to a confirmed actionable finding. This is a textbook Pareto finding in the alert stream, and the failure is not in the customer's environment, but in the tuning of the detection profile. The MSSP onboarded the customer using a generic alert template, rules that work reasonably well across a diverse customer base, but have not been calibrated to this customer's specific environment. The customer is a logistics company. They run automated processes that legitimately trigger high volumes of the exact behaviors the default rules were written to flag. The remediation path is structured. First, for each of the 5 high-volume alert types, you build a suppression logic specific to this customer that excludes the known legitimate behavioral patterns. You do not suppress the alert class globally. That removes coverage. You suppress the specific instances where context confirms legitimacy, and you log the suppression decisions. Second, you establish a review cadence. Every suppression added to this customer's profile is reviewed monthly to confirm it is still valid. If the business process that justified it changes, the suppression should change with it. Third, you reframe the communication with the customer. You are not reducing alerts because the environment is getting safer. You are increasing the signal-to-noise ratio so that the alerts the customer does receive are the ones that actually require attention. The distinction matters for how the customer values the service. The third failure scenario is a patch compliance dashboard that drops from 98% to 85% overnight with no corresponding patching activity. The natural assumption is a data issue. Perhaps the scanner lost visibility to certain assets, or an agent went offline across a subnet. But the investigation reveals something more interesting. A group of assets that were previously categorized as non-production development environments were reclassified as production supporting after a deployment change. They moved into the compliance scope overnight because the asset classification was updated. They had never been patched with production urgency. Their patch posture is genuinely 6 months behind. The Pareto lesson here is in 2 layers. The first is that asset classification must be a continuous process, not a one-time exercise. Assets change roles. Development environments get connected to production data pipelines. Temporary infrastructure becomes permanent. A classification done 18 months ago is not a classification. It is a snapshot that is decaying. Continuous asset discovery and regular classification reviews are not overhead. They are the mechanism by which the 20% remains accurately identified. The second layer is about the compliance metric itself. A compliance percentage that includes all assets equally is a metric that can be gamed by keeping low-risk assets well-patched and neglecting high-risk ones. A compliance metric that weights by asset tier, where being behind on a single Tier 1 asset counts more heavily than being behind on 10 Tier 3 assets, is a metric that reflects the Pareto principle. It measures what actually matters rather than what is easy to count. The role perspective, 3 seats at the same table. The Pareto principle is experienced differently depending on where you sit in the security organization, and each perspective illuminates a different facet of it. The security architect encounters the principle at the design stage, when the question is not what you can build, but what you should build first. A common failure mode in architecture reviews is the proposal that looks excellent on paper, comprehensive, technically sophisticated, well-integrated, but which relies on foundational capabilities that do not yet exist. A zero-trust network access design that assumes a complete and accurate asset inventory, a unified identity provider with full SSO coverage, and reliable device posture telemetry from every managed endpoint is a design that is correct in theory and potentially years premature in practice. The architect's job is not to refuse the sophisticated design. It is to map the dependencies and surface the honest answer about sequencing. You cannot enforce continuous verification if you do not know what devices exist. You cannot enforce per-application access control if you have not cataloged the applications. The architect who leads with a sophisticated design without surfacing the foundational dependencies is not serving the organization. They are creating a roadmap that will stall at the implementation phase and generate a list of excuses about why zero trust is harder than advertised. The architect who leads with the dependencies sequences the foundational work first, and then builds the sophisticated capability on a solid base is applying the Pareto principle as an architectural discipline. The SOC analyst at L2, L3 level encounters the principle as a continuous triage problem. The alert queue is always longer than the team can process at its current size. The question the Pareto principle forces on the L2, L3 analyst is not, how do I process all of these alerts, but which 20% of these alerts deserve 90% of my attention? This is a skill that develops with experience and measurement, but it can also be structured. An analyst who understands the true positive rate of every alert source they monitor is an analyst who knows where to look when they need to find a real incident quickly. An analyst who has documented the behavioral signatures of the most common attack techniques relevant to their environment can triage at speed because they recognize the pattern. An analyst who has no such framework processes alerts procedurally, checking each one according to a runbook without a calibrated sense of which checks actually matter. The Pareto-aware L2, L3 analyst is not working harder. They are working with better prioritization, and the critical alert that would otherwise be buried in the queue gets pulled to the surface because the analyst knows what to look for. The MSSP or MDR security analyst carries the additional complexity of applying the principle across multiple customer environments simultaneously, each with a different risk profile, technology stack, and maturity level. The discipline this requires is the ability to rapidly assess where each customer is on the foundational maturity curve and what the most impactful recommendation for them is right now. For a customer with no MFA, the recommendation is not improved threat hunting playbooks. For a customer who already has MFA, asset inventory, and consistent patching, the recommendation might be detection tuning or tabletop exercises. The MSSP analyst who applies the same advisory template to every customer regardless of their current maturity is not applying the Pareto principle. They are applying a service catalog. The analyst who can walk a customer through a rapid maturity assessment and identify their personal 20% is delivering the kind of value that differentiates a genuine advisory relationship from a commoditized alert forwarding service. Case scenario: the law firm that had to choose. The scenario that brings everything together involves a 6-partner law firm with 42 employees, a part-time IT contractor, and a security budget that has just been approved for the first time in the firm's history. The budget is $30,000 annually. The managing partner, who approved it after a competitor firm was ransomed for $400,000, has one question: what should we spend this on first? The firm's current state is as follows: no MFA on any system. Email is hosted on Microsoft 365, but the security features are on the default configuration. Laptops are running Windows 10, some of which have not received updates in 8 months because the contractor pushed back software update reminders on client-facing machines to avoid interrupting meetings. The firm uses a document management system for client files, which all partners access from personal laptops as well as firm devices. There is no endpoint detection software beyond the default Windows Defender. There is no formal asset inventory. The IT contractor has a general sense of what is in the environment, but nothing documented. A vendor has also approached the firm with a proposal for dark web monitoring and brand protection services. The pitch is compelling. The service scans underground forums and paste sites for mentions of the firm's name, client names, and known email addresses, and alerts the firm if anything appears. The annual cost is $28,000. Applying the Pareto principle to this scenario produces a clear recommendation, and it requires the courage to say no to something that sounds protective. The dark web monitoring service addresses a question that is important but secondary. Have we already been breached, and is our data already circulating? It is a detection capability aimed at a post-breach scenario. It does not prevent any attack. It does not reduce the likelihood that the firm will be targeted successfully. It produces an alert after the damage has occurred. For a firm that has not yet addressed its foundational gaps, that alert will arrive into an environment that has no capability to respond meaningfully. What is the firm's incident response plan when they receive a dark web alert? There is none. What will they do? They do not know. The service detects a problem the firm is not yet equipped to address. The $30,000. applied to the foundational 20%, produces a dramatically different outcome. The first priority is MFA on Microsoft 365 using Microsoft Authenticator. This is included in the firm's existing Microsoft 365 licensing at no additional cost if they have the appropriate tier, which they do. The cost is deployment time, 4 hours of the contractor's time to configure conditional access policies, and a half day for a firm-wide rollout session with brief training. Credential-based attacks against Microsoft 365, the most common entry vector for law firms, are now substantially harder. This costs approximately $500 in contractor time. The second priority is activating the Microsoft Defender for business licenses that are available within their 365 subscription. This provides EDR capability on all managed endpoints. The contractor deploys the agent across all firm laptops in a single afternoon, configures baseline detection policies, and reviews the initial alerts the following week to identify and suppress obvious false positives. This costs approximately $1,000 in contractor time. The third priority is enabling Microsoft Defender for Office 365 Plan 1, which adds safe links, safe attachments, and anti-phishing policies beyond the default Exchange Online protection. This is available at approximately $2 per user per month, totaling roughly $1,000 annually for 42 users. It addresses the most common initial access vector. The fourth priority is a commercial patch management solution for the laptops. A tool like NinjaRMM or AutoMox runs approximately $3 to $4 per device per month. For 42 managed endpoints, this is roughly $2,000 annually. It enables automated patch deployment on a weekly schedule, with emergency patch deployment within 24 hours for critical KEV items. The contractor moves from manually checking updates on an ad hoc basis to having a dashboard that shows patch status across the entire fleet in real time. The fifth priority is a documented asset inventory. This is not a tool purchase. It is 2 days of the contractor's time plus the firm's participation in identifying every device that connects to firm systems, including personal devices used for the document management system. The output is a spreadsheet with each device, its owner, its patch status, and whether it has the Defender agent installed. This is the foundational visibility that makes everything else measurable. The total spent across these 5 priorities is approximately $8,000 to $10,000 in the first year, leaving $20,000 in reserve for the first real incident response engagement, legal fees if a breach notification is required, or investment in the next layer of capability, which might be a periodic external vulnerability assessment or an eventual SIEM at a larger business scale. 3 months after implementing these controls, a phishing campaign targets the firm. The email contains a malicious attachment. Microsoft Defender for Office 365 detonates the attachment in the Safe Attachments sandbox and quarantines the message before delivery. The campaign targets all 42 email addresses. None of the emails are delivered. Zero impact. A competing firm in the same city that chose the dark web monitoring service over MFA and email security is targeted by the same campaign. 2 partners click the attachment. Their Microsoft 365 credentials are harvested via an adversary-in-the-middle proxy. The dark web monitoring service alerts the firm 2 weeks later that their credentials have appeared on a forum. By then, the attacker has exfiltrated 6 months of client correspondence. The dark web service detected the breach. The foundational controls prevented it. This is the Pareto principle made real. The final step in this scenario, the one that makes it complete rather than just successful, is the documentation. The managing partner is briefed on what was implemented, why, and what the remaining risks are. The acceptance of the lower priority risks is documented in a one-page memo signed by the managing partner. It acknowledges that the firm has no dark web monitoring, no formal incident response retainer, and no network monitoring capability. It states that these are known gaps, that they represent a lower priority than the controls now in place, and that they will be revisited at the next annual budget cycle. This memo is not bureaucratic overhead. It is the difference between a risk that was strategically accepted and a risk that was simply overlooked. Closing, the discipline of priority under pressure. There is a version of security work that is infinitely expandable. If you wanted to, you could justify every tool in every category at every tier of sophistication. The threat landscape is real and it is broad. Every gap you have not closed is a gap an attacker could, in theory, use. The anxiety of incompleteness is not irrational. It is a response to a genuine condition. But security work at the organizational level is not infinitely expandable. It is resource-constrained, politically complex, operationally difficult, and measured against a threat environment that is not waiting for you to achieve completeness before it acts. The professional who tries to achieve completeness before delivering protection never delivers protection. The professional who identifies the highest leverage controls, implements them with discipline, measures their effectiveness, and sequences the rest has built something real. The 80-20 rule of security is not a license for laziness. It is not a reason to skip the second 80% once the first 20 is done. It is a sequencing principle, a prioritization discipline, and a corrective for the anxiety that leads teams to pursue sophisticated solutions to low-probability problems while foundational gaps remain open. Every time you are asked to evaluate a security investment, run it through this lens. What percentage of your actual risk does this address? What foundational controls does it depend on for effectiveness? What else could you do with the same resources that would address a larger share of the risk picture? If the answers to those questions favor the investment, proceed. If they do not, the discipline is to say so clearly and offer the alternative that does. The measure of security maturity is not the sophistication of the most advanced control in your portfolio. It is the completeness and reliability of the foundational layer. Everything built on top of that layer is multiplied in value by the foundation beneath it. Everything built without that foundation is fragile, misdirected effort dressed in sophisticated vocabulary. Know your 20%, protect it absolutely. Then and only then reach for the rest. End of session mental model. The 80-20 rule of security, Pareto principle.